Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we'll be covering the next unit on our platformer game, and this will be focusing on getting us a moving enemy. So let's go ahead and jump into all of this. First off, I have created a sprite. Actually, my wife created this sprite for me. And so S Enemy Astronaut is what I have this called. You can call it whatever you want. This is just the name that I am giving it. And you see it's just got 4 frames, it's facing the right, and the little guy is just walking away. Before I jump into the code, I am going to address organizing all of our assets. We are starting to get quite a bit of stuff over here, especially if we open up. One thing that I'm going to cover first is creating a bunch of groups. You can organize these however you want, whatever makes the most sense for you. You can right click, and near the middle there's the option to create group. That essentially is like a folder. So for instance, player related stuff or player sprites. I'm going to move all of the player jump, the player idle, the player walk in here, and then I can minimize that. Okay, that cleans up a little bit more. And now with this, it's cleaner, it's easier. Okay, if I know I need to deal with something with the wall, I can go to my wall folder or my wall group. If I need to go something with related to weapons, I have my weapons group. Now that we have that more cleanly organized, there is one script that I wanted to create before we jump into dealing with the enemy object. Under movement, at least it's tangentially related to it, I'm going to create another script for sprite direction check. This is going to make sure that our sprite is facing the correct direction. In this, we actually had the code in our player state. I wanted to pull that out because we're going to have to do that again. This chunk of code. If horizontal speed does not equal 0, then it checks, okay, the image X scale is the absolute value of the current scale times the sine of the direction it is moving. This flips our sprite. Well, we're going to have to do this, and we're going to do this often, so rather than having that code there and repeated, I'm going to place it inside of our script. And so now that we have that, I can replace it with just the function call down below, like so. Our code still works, everything is fine, but now we have this script, and it is an if statement, if horizontal speed is not equal to 0. So make sure you've copied it over correctly, saved it, it's all good to go. Updated it down here in the player state move. We're just referencing that script. This will make our enemy code easier to manage. So we've got that there. That's been updated. We've now added a new script down below. Now let's go ahead and create our enemy object. But we already have an enemy object. Currently, all this does is starts off with 10 health, has a flash value of 0, and has a hit flash code. I'm going to rename this because I want this to just address targetable. This means it can be shot at, flashes, and that's it. I'm going to create a child of this in my enemies code, or in my enemies group under objects, and create a new object. This is going to be our actual enemy. This is going to be a child of our targetable. So that means it will automatically start off with 10 health, have a flash value of 0. In addition to that, if shot at, it will have hit flash. We don't have to worry about that. That's already been established. Down here, this will deal with everything else that we have to handle. All of our new code is going to introduce for us a way for our character or our enemy to move around and deal with interacting with the world. So first off, of course, we need to have our sprite. Make sure our new sprite from the enemies is my little astronaut. Now you can use whatever you want. I just have the astronaut. And we're going to go ahead and jump into our create event. We already have a create event. What I want to do is inherit this event and add a little bit more to it. So this is our setup. Let me go ahead and increase the size for everyone to see. This will initialize values, and we're going to have our gravity acceleration is equal to 0.3. And before I move on here, I want to create a variable definition. We're going to have a value called level. It defaults to 1 as an integer. And what this is supposed to do is allow for us to modify how our enemy is instance per instance. So I can drop in a bunch of enemies and it defaults to level 1 and everything is fine. But what if I want one enemy to be a little faster, a little slower, to be a little bit more dangerous? I can base it off of this one argument, this one variable, level. And maybe I make this one enemy bigger, so I swap the level to be 2. And then in our create event, we're going to base things off of this level value. I also want to have a horizontal speed. And I believe the player moves at 3 or at 4, so I want mine to move slightly slower than that. And our vertical speed defaults to 0 because it shouldn't begin any movement, though maybe you can swap that out. Depends on what you're going for your game. But this will set up our variable definitions here. In our create event, I want to define what my hit points are. The hit points for the enemy, I want it to be based off of my level, so it will be simply level times 5. So if it's level 1, it's only got 5 health. If it's level 2, it'll have 10 health. 3, 15 health, 4, 20 health. In addition to that, I want to scale up or down my enemy. So image underscore x scale will be equal to level times, or actually it'll be level times, let's see, 50%. So that would be 0.5. So a level 1 enemy will actually be half the size of the sprite. It'll actually be shrunk down. Same thing for image Y scale. It will be equal to level times 0.5. If we had a level 2 enemy, it'll actually be the normal size. If we had a level 3 enemy, it'll actually be slightly bigger, and so on and so forth. And that's actually all we need to address in our create event. I'm going to go ahead and add a step event. That way we can get our enemy to start moving around. This is where the convenient part comes into play because of all these scripts that we wrote. Before we wrote all these scripts and it was only used for our player. Because we knew eventually we would add in an enemy, we of course want to reuse a lot of that code. So in here we check, are we on the floor? This is equal to just check if they're standing on, and then our O wall, or a derivative of a wall if it somehow lands on top of a balloon obstacle. Then we simply have a movement collision check, a gravity check, and then sprite direction check. And now our enemy will mostly work. We are going to run into a current issue, however. With our movement collision check, right now, if you were to walk towards the edge, we as the player can simply say, okay, I'm running into a wall, I'm just gonna turn around. The enemy does not have that feature. If we're going to allow for the code to have the enemy do something more than just run into the wall once it hits the wall, we need the enemy to actually turn around once it hits a wall, so that way it'll go back and forth, back and forth. What I can do is create a new parameter, is enemy, and by default I set this to false. And so that means we don't have to modify any of our existing code. Over in the player side, we didn't pass anything in, so it'll assume it's false. However, here in our code, we're going to pass in true because we are the enemy. Now down below, how are we going to modify our horizontal collision? Rather than just default saying horizontal speed is set to 0, I'm instead going to say if is enemy is true, then we will instead have horizontal speed be times equals -1. It will become positive if it was negative. If it was negative, it becomes positive. Else, and the else portion is for the player, it just sets to 0. If I try to run into the wall, it'll just stop. Now we should be ready to throw our enemy into the world and see what it does. We'll go ahead and go into our room, and in the enemy's layer we have our O targetable. I'm going to remove all except for one of these just so I can show that's still there. I'm going to throw in our O enemy into our bottom area, and then one of our O enemies into our top area, and then another one over here. So if we wanted to test out the scaling, I'm going to go ahead and click on this bottom enemy, and let me go ahead and go to his variables, and I want this enemy to be level 3. So he'll be slightly bigger, and maybe I also want to set it so this enemy's horizontal speed starts going to the left rather than the right, so -3. This enemy, I want this one enemy to start going up, so I'm going to modify this, and it's going to start jumping up with a -2, so he begins with a little upward momentum, level 2, so it'll be the normal size. And then this enemy over here is going to be left as is, so we can see how everything works. Running right now, we have the tiny enemy. This is 50% of the size. It's been scaled downwards. This is the normal enemy size, and this is 150% of the size. They're currently walking back and forth just fine, no issues there. Now if I grab my crossbow and try to shoot at them, but there we go. We now have functional enemies that walk back and forth. They flash whenever you hit them. Later on, we're going to address the code for dealing with killing the enemies, as well as the enemies dealing damage to the player. But those will come in their own times. Otherwise, that's all I've got. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know in class. Everyone, have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.